This is Talking Drupal, a weekly chat about web design development from a group of people with one thing in common. We love Drupal. This is episode 447, Drupal Single Sign On. On today's show, we're talking about Drupal Single Sign On, the benefits it brings to the Drupal community, and a new book called Fog Fireflies with our guest, Tim Lehnen. We'll also cover Drupal.org username field as our module of the week. Welcome to Talking Drupal. Our guest today is Tim Lehnen. Tim is the leader of the Drupal Association engineering team, whose specific mission is to empower the community to build Drupal. He has also recently published a young adult fantasy novel called Fog and Fireflies. Tim, as always, welcome to the show, and thanks for joining us.
Thank you for having me. It's really great to be here. Love it every time.
You're so sweet. I'm John Picozzi, solutions architect at EPAM, and today my co-hosts are joining us for his third tour of duty. Matt Glauman, principal software engineer at Acquia.
Hey.
And also Nick Laughlin, founder at Enlightened Development.
Happy to be here.
The Drop Times is looking for volunteers to cover the upcoming DrupalCon Portland 2024. If you're planning to attend DrupalCon Portland, and if you're able to help with taking photos, videos, or writing articles, we welcome you to join our team of volunteers for the Drop Times. You can reach out to thedroptimes.com/contact or at the Drop Times on X/Twitter. Thank you.
And now, to talk about our module of the week, let's turn it over to Martin Anderson-Klutz, a senior solutions engineer at Acquia and a maintainer of a number of modules of his own. Martin, what do you have for us this week?
Thanks, John. Have you ever wanted to have a field on user profiles specifically designed for Drupal.org usernames? There's a module for that. It's called Drupal.org username field, and it was created in August of 2019 by Hussein Webb, aka Hussein Abbas of Accelerant. It does have a 2.0.0 beta 4 release available, and it is actively maintained. In fact, that release was made less than 6 months ago. Also has test coverage and 8 open issues, none of which are bugs. And it is officially shown on Drupal.org as being in use by one site. Now, the module provides a new field type along with its own widget and formatter. There's a simple checkbox you can use to get the module to validate that a provided username is registered on Drupal.org. But what's really powerful about this module is they can also pull other information from the Drupal.org profile, such as first and last name, country, bio, and more. It does this by leveraging a Guzzle-based API client for Drupal.org that Hussein created as part of a DrupalCon Asia developer contest. Now, I believe the intended use of the module is to use a provided drush command to copy the values from the Drupal.org username field into other fields where they would be displayed to site visitors. Although this module isn't something that a lot of sites will need, I could see it being really useful for Drupal camp websites to automatically collect a lot of the information that many such sites ask users to populate manually. I think it's also an interesting use of the Drupal.org API and could be a useful reference for anyone needing to implement a custom integration. So let's talk about Drupal.org username field.
So I'm going to ask a silly question. Do you think the one site that's using it is actually Drupal.org? Is there like an inception thing going on here?
Yes, we've got layers upon layers of usernames. No, I think it's really cool. I think it's super relevant to what we're going to be talking about today, actually, because when we start talking about the SSO benefits of the project we're doing on D.O, one of them is, in fact, related to letting community sites better use people's D.O identity. It seems like a very logical thing to help pre-populate that information. So that's really cool. I didn't know that existed. That's awesome.
Yeah, and I don't think it's on Drupal.org yet either, because this module is for Drupal 10, and I think Drupal.org it must be getting pretty close to getting ready.
Whoa.
It's not on Drupal 10 yet.
Gloves came off early today.
Golly.
Oh, I'm sorry. I didn't mean it that way.
Jeez.
I just meant
Guys just throwing punches right out of the gate.
No, it's really true though. Yeah, no, it is quite coming along, and actually, this D7 D10 question is another part of why this SSO project is happening. So we'll get there, but no, I think that module would be super useful. I'd actually be really curious to see if some other camp websites, members of the events organizer working group, maybe who are working on a generic events platform that camps can use, maybe should give this a little try and see if it'll serve their needs for that.
Interesting you say that, Tim, because I was going to actually pivot to Martin and go, Martin, is this going to end up in the events platform, code base soon?
Well, I mean, to be honest, that's exactly why I took interest in this originally. I think the sort of hesitation that I have is because by design, we want the event platform to be a little bit more generic and not sort of opinionated, that it's really just for Drupal events. And so to have this in there for sites that aren't Drupal based is, maybe going to potentially create some confusion. So I almost feel like it should be the top of the list of like recommended modules for Drupal camps or something like that.
That makes a lot of sense. Yeah.
I mean, I don't know. I would say add it as a sub possibility, and then you can build a WordPress username plugin and a Sitecore username plugin and all sorts of modules for other event types and whatnot.
I don't know, Martin, if you know this, if that team, like, I follow the event organizer working group meetings periodically, but is that platform ultimately going to be built with a sort of recipe style, that new sort of initiative configuration? Because then I think it could use that either that system to extend it further for certain use cases, and you could have kind of a sub recipe to add the Drupal specific stuff, or possibly eventually publish in the project browser project when that happens, an additional package, so you could have your events platform recipe and then a Drupal event platform recipe.
So there hasn't been, I would say, official discussion about moving it to recipes, but the sort of the way that the event platform was built was very recipe-like. There's probably a few pieces that will have to be spun out into standalone modules, because there is definitely some code in there to provide a few interfaces to make specific things easier. But I would say in general, yes, that's probably going to be fairly high on the list of priorities. I'm not sure if this year, but certainly next year, to get all of that moved over. There's actually a couple of modules that I got a couple of the folks from Canopy's help with getting moved into recipes in the last couple of weeks that are sort of, smart date adjacent modules. But again, very similar in the sense of really being a set of configuration that gets imported. And the process overall didn't seem to take a lot of work. So certainly for projects like the event platform that are largely a set of configuration to use as a starting point, moving those into recipes looks like it's going to be a fairly simple process.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to seeing what happens when recipes become sort of mainstream. I mean, they're obviously the whole concept of them is still in development, and so it's a little cart before the horse maybe, but I think it'll be really interesting once that's available to have distribution-like functionality without this lock-in and in terms of update path and what you can combine and all that stuff. So
especially if we can start providing single directory components to go along with this, so you can kind of mix and match how things look. I think that the future is bright. Going back to this module, I just wanted to mention too, I think it might be useful for the Talking Drupal site when we finally get off of Drupal 7.
Oh my God,
and
yes.
onto Drupal 10 too, because it only took us until about 100 episodes ago, but we finally started gathering Drupal.org information from all of our guests. So it'd be nice to just have a way to validate that and link directly to their profile.
Yeah,
that absolutely is a fabulous idea, Nick. We should work on that. Well, Martin, as always, a very appropriate module of the week. Thank you for sharing with us. If folks wanted to get a hold of you or suggest a module of the week, how could they go about doing that?
We are always happy to get nominations for Module of the Week in the Talking Drupal channel of Drupal Slack. And folks can also reach out to me directly on all the Drupal or social channels as MandClue.
And I'm assuming folks could see you at DrupalCon maybe in a couple of weeks.
That is correct. In fact, anyone watching the YouTube video of this episode can look for me wearing this shirt, which I actually got specifically to wear at DrupalCon. Has a Drupal 11 on the back.
For those folks listening, it is a baseball type jersey of light blue. Kind of looks like a Toronto Blue Jays jersey, if you're familiar. And I believe it says Drupal 11 on the back.
That's correct.
Is going to be outdated when Drupal 12 comes along. Just saying. Or vintage. You could go vintage. That's the way.
Yeah, absolutely. I have a pocket full of Drupal 10 stickers that I'm going to try and furiously get rid of at DrupalCon. So
I imagine I'm going to see those left on a bunch of tables throughout.
It's a good reminder for our listeners, by the way, which is May 6th through 9th, if I've got that date right, here in Portland, Oregon. DrupalCon coming up.
You'll actually see a majority of us there. I think, unfortunately, Nick is the only one that won't be attending, but everybody else should be there. Martin, thank you, and we'll talk to you next week.
All right, see you next week.
Alrighty, let's move on to the primary topic, which is single sign-on. So, Tim, we're going to talk a lot about single sign-on today, obviously, but and more so single sign-on specific to Drupal.org. But for kind of an overview for folks that may not necessarily know what single sign-on is, can you tell folks what single sign-on is and maybe give them an example of where they might have used it before?
Oh, for sure. I think probably at this point, everybody has used a single sign-on service, whether or not they're aware of it. And you can break this down by categories, but probably the most common place that people use this is using your Google identity to authenticate into a variety of websites. It's very common, right? Where you log into one service and you are already sort of prepped and logged into another service or ready to do that. Now, this is a mashup of a couple of different ideas. So one concept is the concept of identity management, where you have a single core account, and that account can be used to authenticate in multiple places. Another concept that gets very frequently sort of mashed up with this idea is the idea of social sign-on, where you have an existing identity that is an entirely third-party identity that you use as that single sign-on identity in a variety of places that might not even be related to that original identity. So again, if you log in with your Twitter account or Facebook account to multiple other services, right, you're using a combination of social sign-on and single sign-on so that you don't have to make new accounts every time you're going to these other services, right? So that's kind of the general concept of single sign-on. And, it has a variety of different benefits for the user, again, not having to make multiple accounts, for the site admins being able to federate the information about that identity between the different properties that you're logging into, and being able to enable other services or options to reduce the friction of people signing up by turning on things like social sign-on.
Okay, so because I'm not smart, I'm gonna need you to go a little bit deeper into single sign-on versus social sign-on, because I kind of thought they were all the same, but like, is single sign-on the idea of like an identity provider providing the identity versus like Twitter?
And it's not like there's very strong overlap in this Venn diagram, right? So
Got it.
Yes.
Okay.
So single sign-on is the notion that there is some identity provider that is the core identity that is being used across multiple logins or multiple web properties, right? Social sign-on is the concept that you can allow people to use one of the major social media providers or other providers to populate that first identity or to be that identity in its entirety. So you might have a single sign-on service for a suite of, online office tools. And that might be able to be something you can register uniquely to that service as a single identity across multiple tools. But that service might also say, hey, want to log in with your Facebook or want to log in with your Google to get started, and let you do that. So that would be using both single sign-on and social.
So Aha, I got it. So single sign-on is I log into a site, it goes out and pings the identity provider. It says this person is who they say they are. Social
Yep.
sign-on is I say I want to use Twitter. It goes to Twitter, gets my stuff, and creates an account on that site for my use.
More or less. Yep, exactly. And lets you
Got
sort of
it.
save a bunch of steps in terms of how many logins you manage, how much information you have to fill out, all these kinds of things. Yep.
Think of social sign-on as like a fork and forget and passwordless login. So instead of creating a new password, you log in there, but a lot of times you have to like go enter in your first and last name, or you can change those and it's not governed. So like in that other service, you could change your name and other details because it's not governed by the social source. That's just like replacing your password, basically.
Yeah. So there's a question there that came to my mind. Like, so in the social sign-on scenario, like is your password living on that service independently of its original form on Twitter?
So
you wouldn't have a password.
Yeah. So that's
okay.
yeah,
So they would still check back and say like, yes, this is a valid user, and
right.
And,
so these are
got it.
they're still basically looking for a valid like token or session from the social service.
Got
to
it.
say, hey, you exist and you match this record in our identity management system, and so we're going to let you in.
Yep.
In some cases, you can do both. They'll let you say, I do want to have the option of just using my username and password, but I also want the option to skip that by saying, hey, I'm already logged into my Twitter or whatever it is.
There's also benefits on both sides of the coin for the single sign-on. So imagine a world where there is no single sign-on, and just using Google as an example, you sign into google.com, and then you click on a link to go to drive.google.com, and now you have to log in again. And then you click on a link and go to youtube.com. Now you have to log in again. And if you change one of the passwords on one of those sites, now you have different passwords for the same account across different something.google.com. And on the other side, if Google decides that they need to, I don't know, ban a user or something because they're providing spam, in single sign-on, they just ban the user account, and that user will get logged out and be unable to log into any service. In the non-single sign-on situation, they need to go to every single service and site that they manage and see if that user exists on every single one and ban them. I mean, there's other benefits and other conveniences, but those are, I think, the two biggest from a user side. The convenience is you just log in once and then everything is logged in. And from the management side, if you need to make a change or even update something, if you want to update your name or username or something, in single sign-on, you do that in one place and everything updates. And non-single sign-on, you have to go to nowadays, sometimes 20, 30 different services for one company and update it. My first time integrating single sign-on with Drupal was over 10 years ago. So in my experience, Drupal has supported single sign-on in some form or another for a long time. What makes this different than what people are used to in Drupal?
So that's a really good question. So first of all, the current Drupal.org actually does have a version of single sign-on, basically, right? It's using the bakery module, which was a thing during the Drupal 7 year.
Yeah. I forgot about that module.
And the bakery module is kind of adorable in that way of like people are being slightly too clever with how they've named things in a way that makes sense if you're got the inside joke, but is probably confusing to people trying to understand how it works, because the bakery module bakes cookies. And so it passes around cookies for authentication to different like subdomains and across different sites, and then allows you to sync profile data between them, right? So it's a single sign-on provider, but it's sort of existed. It was being created around the same time that more generic single sign-on options were first being created. So it sort of kind of predates and does its own thing a little bit. But it will literally, I think the main authentication cookie it creates is called a chocolate chip cookie in the code. And there's a few other cookie types. So it's kind of a cute module, and it does some really good things. And that is technically what's being used for single sign-on with your Drupal.org identity right now. But it's just between the Drupal 7 properties that exist. And so, if we go before we even started migrating any Drupal 10 sites, it was events. There was a dedicated association site at one point, Drupal.org, localize, API, right? Those variety of G.only properties. But so we've had that.
Right?
Sorry?
Groups and security too, right?
Yep. All those things. And so we've had that for a long time, going back pre-Drupal 7 even. I think it was a bakery version in 6 and all that kind of stuff. And that's great, but it was very sort of specific to the one purpose, which was just letting you authenticate between the D.O sites. And it was not extensible to include social sign-on options to make like, hey, if you want to start your D.O account, can we give you a jump start getting through those hoops if you already have a GitHub account maybe, or if you already have something else, right? We didn't have that capability. We also, speaking of that impending doom of migrating to Drupal 10, it also is not maintained for Drupal 10. It wasn't created, why would someone take this weird custom bakery SSO and make a D10 version really when there's now new SSO options? And what we want to be able to do is we want to be able, during our upgrade process, to let you cross-authenticate between D10 and D7 sites as we are progressively migrating different parts of the site and different properties on Drupal.org. So, one of the benefits is it'll enable us to do this upgrade without it being a big bang upgrade where we have to do everything at once. Another benefit is we are going to standardize on a open source identity management system, which we can talk about in a minute. And then the last benefit is we can begin to extend this in a couple of different ways following the initial deployment. So we can start to extend it to allow your D.O identity to be used by third-party sites, not just Drupal.org, to do things similar to what we were talking about with the module, where, hey, maybe the camp websites want to implement this and let you log in just with your D.O account.
Oh.
And perhaps pass some information back and forth both ways. So we would learn a little bit more. Maybe we could automatically update D.O profiles with which camps you attended if we had a standard for that for camps implementing this, right? Instead of having it be a manual process where you update your profile and say, hey, I went to New Jersey camp, or I went to whatever it might be.
So, dear listener, if you haven't put 2 and 2 together to get 4 yet, we're not talking about SSO, Drupal modules, and the way you can implement SSO into your own Drupal site specifically. We're really talking about SSO on Drupal.org.
We'll touch on both, because I think if there are folks who really want to hear about SSO for their own Drupal solutions, I think what we're doing for D.O is one example of something that people could use in their own Drupal installations, right? So that's certainly something that we could draw some analogies to as we talk through this further. So
I'll say it sounds like single sign-on for Drupal.org is really important for the Drupal 10 upgrade for various sites. But I was wondering, is there more to it? Because bakery is bespoke, and now will this enable things like OpenID or SAML as it is, so that way you can do more federated identity management?
Yeah, exactly. So this is going to maybe this is a good place to talk a little bit about what the stack is going to be a little bit. So from a Drupal module side, we're using the OpenID Connect module as what's going to be the primary authentication module that's used on these sites for this purpose. So yes, it will be OpenID compatible, and it's also the actual identity management is based on Keycloak, and we're using a hosted provider. I think we'll talk about who that is a little bit later, but Keycloak is, I think, a Apache Software Foundation originally project, but Keycloak is an open source single sign-on solution that is OAuth2, OpenID, all of these compatible, that has social sign-on extensions. So it's an open source solution for doing SSO and identity management that we selected because it gives us the capacity to roll out some of these greater ideas that we're talking about, not just, as you said, not just the important part that helps our upgrade with D10 and D7 stuff, but some of our future ambitions around campsites and things like that. And then also, we want it to be an open source project. So we're not locked into an identity vendor at a particular service, but if we need to, we could roll our own. We could move between Keycloak providers, all that sort of a thing.
I think it's interesting that, so now the module that you said you're using with Drupal, is that what you said, OpenID Connect? Is that the one?
Right.
Yeah, so that's a module that works with a couple of different identity providers, right? It's not specific to just one. So now, I'm assuming the DA has the DA had to either build a specific connection for your identity provider, or have you guys been doing some development to kind of bring that bring that module up to the level at which you need it, or has it just been
A little
ready
bit
to
of both,
go
actually.
out of the
Yeah.
box? Yeah. Okay.
So Keycloak itself supports the kind of authentication standards that a lot of identity, like, so there's like Matt referred to some of these earlier, right? There's OAuth2, OpenID, SAML. There's a variety of things that are like sort of standard ways to manage SSO related either like transfer of information or authentication and things like this, right? And so Keycloak supports some of those standards because it's good open source software that's standards based. But also the OpenID Connect module was built to be able, the reason it can support multiple identity services is because it was built to support those different types of standards that they implement. But we did have to do some work in terms of specific configuration, specific kinds of setup, and also some contribution back to that module and some custom code related to some things we do once we have the authentication to D.O. And we're actually working with some of the folks on the at Tag One to help us out with making sure the module's in good shape, making sure our Keycloak configuration is in good shape, and making sure our migration process for users is set up. So you'll see some contributions on that module, I think, from Lucas Hedden on Drupal.org, and then possibly from Marvel07 or Marco, who's been doing some work with us on that recently as well. So you may see that when you're checking out these modules.
I'm going to say for folks that are curious, Keycloak is part of the CNCF, the Cloud Native Foundation. So that means it's amongst peers like Kubernetes, Linkerd. So for all the DevOps folks, they probably maybe already knew that, but yeah, it's part of a large consortium of all like the major cloud services and projects.
Yeah, and the sort of generic name for these sort of sets of things is often IAM, Identity and Access Management sort of software.
So I want to go back to something you mentioned a little bit earlier as an event organizer. I'm interested in talking a little bit more about kind of camps being able to use SSO. And in the show notes, we have a link to your blog post on the Drupal website about this topic. But I'm wondering about the possibility of sharing information, right? And how you kind of envision at this early stage that working, right? So like obviously SSO, somebody coming to a camp website, being able to log in with their Drupal credentials is pretty straightforward. But I'm wondering how information would or could be shared and what types of like kind of like opt-ins folks might have to check or work towards to be able to do that.
Right. So it's going to be a little bit interesting, and we're still working out what exactly the process will be once we get the sort of initial deployment done. But there are some factors you touched on that are going to be really important. So one is we do want to make sure that if people are using the Drupal.org identity, that it's being done in spaces that respect the Drupal code of conduct and all of these kinds of things, and agree to work with us in the event that there's any sort of issues, right? Because once we have shared data that gets copied to a profile on another site, then that data now has another surface area where if that site, that event finishes and that site gets abandoned for years and it doesn't get a security update, maybe some user data becomes at risk. Now, we're not passing, when you authenticate this way, you're not passing passwords or things like that. So that's not the kind of stuff, but you might have other field data that you've copied over. So there's a few things. We'll probably be effectively sort of allow listing the endpoints, the sites that would be allowed to do this authentication, and asking the people to manage those sites to enter in a sort of data protection agreement with the DA and agree that they're going to continue to enforce the Drupal code of conduct in those community spaces and some things like that. And then we'll also need to set some standards for what control you give users or what messaging you provide users. So, for example, when you say, hey, here's the option to log in with your Drupal.org identity, just be aware that if you choose to do this, the camp organizers will be able to see your email address, right? You probably want that because you probably want the camp organizers to be able to email you, but we need to make people aware of that kind of stuff. Similarly, we do want that data to, like I said, to try and be a sort of two-way street. And we don't need probably to send back any kind of PII stuff to Drupal.org that you would collect on the campsite. I don't think that would ever be a consideration. But we would love to know, right? Like, hey, can you tell us that these are attendees at whatever camp on whatever year? So we'll try and figure out those things. We'll have to come up with some standards for how we're doing that. Maybe that will mean figuring out like a specific set of best practices for configuring your SSO with D.O on your campsite in different ways. So we'll figure some of that out. But that's kind of the goal, right? Make it easier, make it more frictionless for someone who's already on D.O to be like, hey, I want to check out this local camp and maybe go to their first in-person event.
Yeah, I think that'd be helpful. I mean, there's a lot to go in there because at least for the camps we run, like we normally store like the people that spoke and which session they spoke at, but we don't store who attended because we record attendance in the ticketing app, which is a completely separate service that we use. And I'm sure every camp uses a different service, but if there's an easy, that's one of the benefits of the event platform too. If you come up with the standard, the community can meet that standard and make it easier to track that stuff.
Yeah, I think that would be super valuable. And it would help us, right, from the DA's perspective, that helps us understand the health of the community. Right now, if we want to know what attendance is like at Drupal events and how healthy these events are, we basically have to interview the organizers and see what kind of information we can get, or do some community surveys. Or at a bare minimum, we have to look at the community events page and just see how many events are currently, like, how healthy does that look? How many are showing up around the world? Are there any gaps in places where there used to be events? But that's very sort of subjective or seat of the pants kind of data gathering. Whereas if we can get some more stuff, we might know, hey, wow, there's I would have no idea if there's a really successful camp that happens every year in Japan. I just wouldn't know. I'd have no clue. But if we were offering this kind of thing to those folks, maybe they would choose to use the SSO option. Maybe we would start getting back data, and maybe we'd be like, hey, wow, that's a community that we should celebrate and support in some way. So interesting.
So my next question is something that as soon as I saw this topic came up for me, and that is GitLab integration. The DA has been doing great work trying to leverage tools that already exist to allow us to focus innovation in other areas. And GitLab integration has been one of the biggest successes, I think, from a developer perspective of that. There's also some sort of like single sign-on, I think, communication between Drupal.org and GitLab. But how does this impact that?
That's a really good question. We might just continue to use the current integration because right now the account provisioning steps and everything, they actually work pretty well between D.O and GitLab. And it's using, I think it's using JWT tokens. It's one of their inbuilt things. Or we might say, hey, let's just kind of standardize this and connect it to the SSO system. It could go either way. Either way, we certainly want your experience going between Drupal.org and git.drupalcode.org to be transparent, which it more or less is now, but we want to make sure it continues to be easy enough to go back and forth between D.O itself and where you're contributing code.
Yeah, I would say I would classify it as mostly transparent. There are some cases where sometimes if you click on a certain link, you can get de-authenticated on GitLab, and then
without it, and then you wind up in a little bit of a login loop.
Yeah. Yes, which is incredibly frustrating when it happens.
Yeah, there's a few edge cases like that
rare.
for sure. And so this might be something where either those are weird. Those are some weird like session invalidation cases that we're going to have trouble with either way, or that might be fixed by switching to a more standard SSO. So we'll have to revisit a couple of those things once this main thing's out there. But certainly, right, that's one of the basic ideas, is to start to have third-party tools that it's easier to authenticate into.
Absolutely.
So we mentioned it briefly and about using other platforms to jumpstart your Drupal.org profiles. Like, would it be like GitLab login for Drupal.org, or is there like a set, like, known, like, we should target these platforms for social sign-in?
Yeah, totally. So absolutely, that's the case. I think so let me make a distinction for listeners who might not be super involved in Contrib and might not know this. But so on Drupal.org, if you're contributing to Drupal, you are using our self-hosted version of GitLab. So you're not using GitLab.com. You're using git.drupalcode.org. And it's the latest version of GitLab. It's the enterprise edition, well, the open source edition. And it has features and configuration and some stuff that we do with the permissions to make it easier to collaborate. And it's awesome. But if you are like, hey, I haven't ever contributed before, but I already have a GitLab.com account, or I already have a GitHub account, how do I do this Drupal thing? What you find is, well, gosh, I can click on git.drupalcode.org, but I don't see how to log in. And how do I open a merge request? And what do I need to do? I have to make a D.O account. Okay, I'll go make a D.O account. But then have I lost the like path that I was on when I was trying to do my contribution? And now I have to accept these Git terms of service. And how do I do? Right, you run through these multiple extra steps when you're like, hey, I'm an experienced developer who's on GitHub all the time. Why does it take me all these extra steps to get into doing a contribution to Drupal? So the goal is definitely to target using your GitHub identity to log in, using your GitLab.com identity to log in. Those are actually probably our first two biggest targets for external identities, even over the other social options, right? Because sure, yeah, it's also great if we can let people log in with their Google accounts or whatever it might be. But really, the friction we're trying to reduce is someone who says, well, I've already got GitHub. Let me get in. It's got most of what we need. So that's definitely, I think, one of the early follow-on goals after we deploy it just for Drupal itself.
Cool. Yeah, I can imagine the whole local, or the local instance, let's just say local instance of like GitLab, where there's not GitLab.com, it's our own. And the only other open source project I know of that has its own GitLab instance is Civi CRM. So I'm sure for most developers, one, everything's on GitHub. There's not that much on actually GitLab.com. And then there's also the complexity, it's not really complexity, but the extra curveball of it's not GitLab.com, it's its own instance. So there's this extra layer. And that'll be really cool to see that those layers exist, but they'll be flattened to the end.
Yeah, exactly. Dropping them down a little bit. And, just not to spend too much time on this, but there is a reason why, some projects, I think GNOME is also an individual instance, possibly, I can't remember. There's definitely a few folks who've done it. And generally speaking, when an open source project decides to do that, it's for one of two reasons, or both: scale or workflow. And in our case, it's kind of both, right? Drupal.org hosts 50,000 repositories, just ourselves, just for Drupal-related projects. Now, 40,000 of those are for older versions of Drupal. It's probably about 10,000 that are active in the latest version of Drupal, but still, that's a lot of repositories to manage. And then workflow, we do some very specific things to ensure that we have collaborative by default issue forks, which is really cool and something that I would love to see go back upstream as a way you could configure projects on GitLab.com or even GitHub, and which we talked to them about for years before deciding, okay, we'll do it with our own instance. And then also permissions management, right? So we want to be able to do like project adoption in a centralized way. We have this process right now where if maintainers sort of go missing, someone can apply to say, hey, I'll take over this module and maintain it in the future. And that requires us to have certain amounts of access to be able to grant that, or else we wind up with weird forks and trying to push people over to say, no, this is the new official one, and things like that. So there's a lot of reasons why this is set up the way it is. But at the same time, we want to get to a point where someone who's maybe used Drupal for the first time for their first project at work like 6 months ago, and they're like, oh, there's this thing we ran into. Let me see if I can just get this bug fixed upstream. And they're like, oh, here's the module on git.drupalcode.org. Here's the login. Oh, it tells me I need an account, but look, great. I can just sign in with my GitHub and I'm back there to make the change, right? So like the fewer steps in between becoming a first-time contributor, the better.
This sounds magical, Tim. I'm not going to lie. So just to play it out, if I'm like a hardcore GitHub user and I come to Drupal.org, right, in a perfect world, I'll be able to log into Drupal.org with my GitHub credentials and then basically go to Drupal's hosted GitLab and create a merge request and like make code changes, all without, air quotes, having to create another GitLab account or do anything additional.
Yeah, there's a few steps when you sign in with an identity provider usually where it's like, oh, here's a couple extra fields that we need for our site compared to what we can get. So there might be still a little bit of an interstitial step. We'll have to see exactly how much of that we can skip by using one of these social providers. But that's the vision, is to get as close to what you just described as we can. Again, trying to reduce that friction of contribution.
That sounds amazing. The funny side note here, the problem I always have is then remembering which service I use to sign into a site. Because it's like, did I use Google for this, or did I use Apple, or was it something else? Or but anyway, that's more a me problem than an anybody else problem. Let's talk a little bit about Cloud IAM. What is that?
So Cloud IAM is a hosted Keycloak provider. So rather than rolling our own Keycloak servers, Cloud IAM hosts Keycloak instances for organizations, companies, nonprofit, open source foundations, whoever it might be, who want to run an open source identity management provider like Keycloak without doing the infrastructure management and upkeep and those sorts of things. And so they're based in France. And so basically this is just kind of Keycloak as a service for us to use.
Got it.
And just to kind of clarify, correct me if I'm wrong, but Keycloak is the identity provider. It's the one that stores the actual password, the actual authentication. It handles all that stuff for you so that, you can, for example, put that into a website. But the nice thing is this kind of separates it. So there's less attack surface and
there's this sort of central place, like you were saying before, so that if multiple different services need it, you're not cloning it all over the place or recollecting it, right? Yeah. So right. So Cloud IAM is a service provider that hosts Keycloak. Keycloak is the actual open source identity management software. And one of the reasons we picked them is they're very sort of open source as an organization. And so it's fully portable, right? If we ever decided we wanted to roll our own Keycloak servers, or if we needed to move to a different provider, a fundamental part of our agreement is we can export all of our Keycloak config to spin up our own instance without being like locked into a particular identity management vendor. So yeah, it's really great.
And there's a lot of value there, because if you think about it, when you're looking at SSO for a traditional project, you're probably going to look at Okta or Auth0 or something like that. If you can move between Auth0 and Okta, but they're separate systems, separate providers. That's a major undertaking. Whereas, and not to say like setting up your own server, making sure it's secure, making sure versions are compatible. That's not a minor project, but it's much easier to move a similar piece of infrastructure to your own infrastructure than it is to set up a completely new provider.
Literally we can kind of not to make it sound easier than it is, but we can basically sort of dump out the database and all of the config of this Keycloak instance, imported it into a new Keycloak instance hosted somewhere else, and be kind of back up and running, right?
Yeah.
So it's not so much a migration so much as a again, kind of a hosting choice for an open source platform. Which was important to us. Yeah.
Awesome. Were there any other considerations when you were picking them? Because I noticed, for example, they're GDPR compliant and they're in France. Was that part of
too? Yeah, that is part of it as well. So we picked them because they're focused on first of all, we were pretty sure we wanted to find someone who does Keycloak because it is open source, because it's Cloud Native Computing Foundation, because it's a well-supported kind of project. So first of all, that kind of set some parameters. There are a lot of other identity providers out there, but we picked them also because they have an open source ethos. They're excited to support Drupal as an open source project. So they cut us a bit of a deal, which certainly helps. A lot of these hosted identity providers go per user. And I don't know if I've mentioned this yet, but the user database for Drupal.org, which is a 20-year-old website, is like 2 million users. And a lot of those users they're like blocked users from historical waves of spam and all sorts of things. But we kind of still need that too, so that those things remain blocked after we migrate. So anyway, there was a little bit of the affordability factor, the partnership factor, the understanding open source factor. And then also, because they're in France, because they're in Europe, they're in a region of the world that has stricter privacy protections, that has GDPR compliance, which looks like it will effectively be it already is the template for other privacy regulations going into effect around the rest of the world. And so that puts us on the right foot in terms of being ahead of all of the privacy and data protection considerations.
So it sounds like there's a good collaboration already going on between Cloud IAM and the DA. Do you see what might future collaboration be? Like, are they if they're providing the hosting, could they also be a liaison with the project for upstream changes? Like, if we don't have...
Yeah, that's actually a really good question. So in some ways, they've done a little bit of this already, and they've done a couple of things. So first of all, in the blog post, which we have linked in the show notes, they were really eager to offer discounts to other Drupal organizations who wanted to host Keycloak, right? Because there aren't actually a huge number of Keycloak hosting options out there. And if you did want to use an open source identity provider and you wanted one that was privacy centric and not vendor lock-in, fully portable, they are a really good choice from that point of view. So check that out if you're looking at it. But secondly, they have, they really do a managed service in terms of, as new releases of Keycloak come out, they have a coordinated release process for upgrading to those versions. They have their own internal auditing process for managing the security of all these identity stuff, as you would expect for someone handling something as important as authentication. And I think we've already worked with them somewhat on certain key elements of what Keycloak does and what some of their wrapping around Keycloak can do. I'm trying to think of a great example, but one of the items was related to multi-factor authentication and MFA tokens, because we'd like to be able to migrate the MFA seeds so that the users on D.O don't have to who are using two-factor don't have to reset that up. We're pretty sure we've got that working, but we've got that. We've collaborated with them a little bit to figure out, we needed to be on a newer version of Keycloak. We needed to check XYZ. We needed something in their interface for doing some of this stuff. So it's really kind of a partnership, and it's something that hopefully will continue to be fruitful for both of us.
I can't stress enough too how big of an undertaking this type of thing is. I mean, SSO theoretically it can be smooth to set up, but even when it's smooth, you have to be very careful when you're testing because it's very easy to accidentally configure yourself into a situation where you can no longer log into your website. And even once you get the configuration right, if something goes wrong during the migration, like a lot of times when you're migrating content or something, like, you kill it, rerun the migration, whatever. When you're migrating authentication related data, like, you really want it to go right the first time. And 2 million, my biggest migration was 1.5 million users for a project. That migration took 85 hours to run.
Yeah.
It's not as simple, and you do have to run the full migration a couple of times because there's always edge cases that you have to catch. So I can't understate the amount of work that you guys must be doing to get this right. This has got to be a multi-year project, I imagine, because
it has
huge.
been.
So this This all sounds amazing, and I want to run out and use it like right this second. But knowing that, obviously, as Nick just said, it's an undertaking and there's probably a process being followed. I'm wondering, where are you guys in the process of implementing this?
Well, that's really exciting because we're very close to the finish line, actually. So, speaking of what you just said, Nick, we just ran a migration of the user database, which took about a week to complete.
Wow.
It finished on Friday of last week and that was a full migration, and it's part of our migration testing process to again catch edge cases, just like you're talking about. So, for example, towards the end of last fall, we had done another test migration, and that helped us to identify, okay, are there places where there are incompatible UTF-8 characters between what Keycloak accepts and what's in the Drupal.org database, right? Are there differences in the acceptable password standards between what we have and what was in there? Like all of these kinds of things, right? So we worked out tons and tons and tons and tons of these edge cases. The last thing we found in this sort of final migration is less than 300 more than 20-year-old accounts, basically, or almost 20-year-old accounts that were part of a migration from an era when you could migrate to Drupal.org where you could sign up to Drupal.org without even providing an email address. So that are in some invalid format. Like they're very, very early on. They allow backslashes and they allow, like, I forget what it is, a couple weird things, but they're all accounts at this point. We're down to accounts that actually probably don't need to exist. Nothing's been logged into since I think the most recent one in 2008. We'll just do a username alter to remove the invalid characters at this point, and that'll resolve our last batch. So what that means is we are just about ready to configure the catch-up migration process so that we are keeping this as close to up to date as we can, so that when we actually have an outage window to do the authentication switchover, it's relatively short, and if someone made a password change recently, that it didn't get reverted in the process of the migration, right? So that's more or less where we are. There's a few things there that we need to do as edge cases. We are probably not going to go ahead and decide to deploy that right before DrupalCon on the off chance that we just
really? Why not? You only live once. Come on.
We might not want everybody to like suddenly get locked out of their accounts right before contribution week at DrupalCon. That might be bad. But we kind of thought about it because we're like really that close. So it's a pretty exciting time.
So you mentioned you're working on the catch-up process. I mean, what are the next steps? Like, what does the QA look? Well, actually, first of all, you mentioned Lucas and Marco working on the OpenID integration module, but who else is working on this project right now?
There's a few different folks. Neil Drum, myself, Lucas and Marco. We're really kind of the primary group right at the moment. And then we're doing the QA process. Sort of fortunately, we get good log data back from how this migration script was built to alert us of potential invalid data. And then we have some test kind of cases, like we can check and see, hey, did this, right? We pick a set of accounts that we control that have MFA enabled, and we can check and see, are those still able to work with their seed migrated, that kind of stuff. So we have a little bit of a script to go through. So it's a combination of, right? Because so there's the migration and the authentication into Keycloak. Then there is the actual enable that module in a development or staging environment and make sure it works when it's all wired up. And then there's sort of the production deployment of those pieces. So those are the components that are being mapped out by that group of people.
Okay, very cool. And do you have a rollback plan, or because those are always really difficult in these types of situations too?
Sorry. Yeah. So
I mean, who needs a rollback plan?
I mean, worst case scenario, basically we restore the DD. We basically just toggle back to D.O authentication with the existing bakery stuff, right? Because essentially what we're going to do we haven't wiped out that data in the course of the migration. So we can kind of toggle which authentication method is active, And once we're sure it's worked in the production deployment and it's like settled in for a while, then we'll go back and do cleanup of the previous authentication process. So
yeah, that'll be nice. I imagine 2 million user records mostly being removed will save a fair amount of database space too.
Well, we'll see. Again, some of it's true actually. There's going to be, but the truth is there's still a profile on Drupal.org, even if the core authentication pieces, name, email, password, and stuff, are primarily in the identity provider, and then some of the subsites have extra unique profile fields. So there'll still be some of that, but that's not the primary goal. Again, the primary goal here is reducing friction, making it easier for people to get from new to Drupal to contribution, and then hopefully these additional things like supporting campsites and data federation.
So you said not before DrupalCon. I know you may not be able to put an exact date, but could we do is it like after DrupalCon North America and maybe before DrupalCon Europe?
Yeah, it would definitely be that. It might even be shortly after. It might even just be shortly after DrupalCon. I want to say after DrupalCon because I'm still sort of tempted to say that if a miracle happened, it could happen a few days after recording this, because that would give us enough time in the event of a rollback. But no, probably after we've had a chance to return from DrupalCon, breathe, catch up on sleep, we would schedule a window and announce that to everybody.
As a experienced developer, please do not do it. But even though I'm not going to DrupalCon, please don't do it before.
I know.
Save yourself the sanity.
As somebody who likes to roll the dice from time to time, I say, roll those dice.
Yep.
I think I heard this correctly, and I'm just reading this question that I wrote that says, at this point, what does the onboarding process look like? And it sounds like for D.O users, like literally nothing is going to change. You're still going to go to D.O and log in as you normally would. It's just going to be using a different back-end system to validate you. Is that accurate?
Yeah, you'll see something slightly different, which is to say you'll see a login page that looks just a little bit different. It'll mention, you're logging in with a Keycloak through Cloud IAM at the bottom of the page. So the login page will look a little bit different, but it'll do the same thing and redirect you back into your account after you log in. And then the only thing that'll change is eventually, on top of that, as we add some of those social sign-on options, you'll start seeing those logos appear as options for it. But it should be pretty transparent, right? There's no manual step that you need to take to do this. It'll be it should be a transparent process when we just finish that deployment.
I have two follow-up questions now that I'm thinking about how I log into Drupal.org, or more specifically, when I get logged out of Drupal.org. So on the login, there's like two-factor authentication obviously set up. Is that still going to exist? Will you have to reset that up with Keycloak?
We are hoping that we can migrate the seeds so that you do not have to reset it up. We may have to reset it for folks.
Okay, not the end of the world, but something that we'll cross when we get to it. And then I know that D.O only leaves you logged in for like 60 days, 90 days, something like that. 60 days, maybe
something like that. Yeah.
Yeah. Is that still going to be the case? Are you still going to get logged out, or are you going to be able to kind of keep that going for longer?
It's a good question. I'm actually not certain what I'm sure Neil knows what the sort of session expiry for the Keycloak stuff is and how that interacts with Drupal session stuff. So I'm not sure I have the right answer for you. I will say that it's generally good practice to have some kind of session expiry, but whether or not it needs to be as short as it is now is certainly an open question.
Like 365 days feels reasonable.
Well, I actually have a follow-up question. In your testing, have you
to my follow-up question?
Yeah, follow-up to your follow-up. In the recent testing, did you expire sessions? Because I did get logged out twice in the last 2 weeks.
Nothing that would have affected production, no. So that's probably, we talked earlier about some of these kinds of edge cases. The other thing is, I'm not sure if you're aware, but there are some conditions in which certain browsers now just early expire session data, regardless of what the site settings are for how long lived those sessions are.
I like how Nick insinuated there that the DA would be testing these things on production.
We do it on Friday afternoons on production.
Well, I
Yeah,
did.
no,
I
no.
was going to mention that the migration on a Friday. That's
No, it
interesting.
ended on a Friday. He said it
Yes.
didn't start on a Friday.
We didn't know
No,
how long it would last. That was the point of that test.
All right. Well, I guess that's fair. That's fair.
no. I mean, there's situations where you're not testing on production where you discover something that goes, we should expire sessions on production.
Oh
for
yeah,
some
no,
reason.
you're totally
Yeah,
right.
yeah.
There are some cases where, and in fact, we may even want to figure out how to. I don't think this is actually necessary. There may be, when we do this cutover, there may be a little bit of session wonkiness as people are re-authenticating, right? So, but that's fine.
We've now pushed the timeline till after DrupalCon because now Tim has to go ask about expiry timelines.
Yeah.
No worries.
John is trying to make this more contentious for my side than I'm trying.
Oh no, I'm not. There's no contention here.
That's all.
No, so here's a question. So you've mentioned that SSO with Drupal.org will mostly be allow listed, and the primary target right now on outgoing connections. Actually, I suppose where people are using Drupal as the identity provider are camps. But there are some other community sites like contrib.social or contribkanban.com. Do you think those would be candidates as well to use, Drupal.org SSO?
I don't necessarily see why not. I mean, we've certainly talked about Fediverse stuff kind of for the different chat services and things that people are using. It'd be nice to be able to have that tied to D.O identity. And that's a question we've got before. Contrib Kanban is going to be interesting because I feel like Contrib Kanban at some point here, when we finish the GitLab issue migration, there'll be Kanban in issue queues. And I don't know what the future plans for Contrib Kanban might be, but potentially that as well. Yeah, I mean, I don't see why not. I think it's not immediately top of mind, but definitely when I think about the Rocket Chat, Matrix, Slack, like all these different kinds of identities, right? It'd be nice if we could do those things too. So we'll have to see.
Yeah, that'd be nice. It would certainly make finding people on the Drupal Slack a lot easier because some people use completely different usernames.
Yeah. Yep.
So I'm curious, can the community help with this effort? Like, would it be contributing to the OpenID Connect module or in some other way?
Yeah, I think in the long term, so this in terms of the immediate migration, we're in pretty good shape. So I feel like there's not too much outstanding, at least unless we find something at the 11th hour. That active, like I can't point you to an issue right now that's like that needs to land before we can do this or anything like that. I actually think we're mostly in good shape. That said, it wouldn't hurt if other folks who maybe already use OpenID Connect or other kinds of, with their own SSOs, even if it's with other providers, maybe participate in helping to keep that maintained on an ongoing basis. Also wouldn't hurt. Now I'm reaching, but if you want to look at the Keycloak issue queue and maybe contribute to a non-Drupal project, Keycloak is a really cool idea to have this CNCF open source thing. But no, in terms of like, hey, can the community come in and really help us accelerate this? In this particular case, we're actually in pretty good shape. So hopefully what we're doing is going to be accelerating you and making it a little bit easier for you to do your Drupal related contributions.
Tim, you might have said this and I might have missed it, but is the Drupal Association creating a submodule for the ID Connect module for Keycloak or Cloud IAM and contributing that back, or is it just a plugin for the OpenID Connect module?
I don't remember what the literal structure is. I think it's actually just in the main. The things that we needed to tweak or get committed were just in the main OpenID Connect repo, if I recall. So, and then we have a few little things. We have some glue code stuff that's in the Drupal.org custom module, but that's not, I don't think those are things related to what other folks are using. That's more like some cross-site management stuff. So,
got it.
Yeah.
Perfect. Well, as we teased at the top of the show, before we let you go, Tim, I'd love to hear a bit more about your new or newish book. I'm not really sure exactly when it came out. You recently self-published this book. Could you tell us a little bit more about it?
I can. So this is it right here. This is Fog and Fireflies. And this is a young adult fantasy novel, as we talked about a little bit at the top. I would say fiction is actually one of my biggest passions, and writing fiction, and it's something I've always done and wanted to do more of. Some folks might know this, I was an English and philosophy major in school, but I made Drupal sites to help pay tuition. So that's kind of how I wound up there. And this book has been, to be honest, kind of a long project. It came out just April 11th, which just last Thursday, which is a date I picked because it was also my anniversary with my wife, and that seemed kind of fun. She was the very first person that I bounced around ideas for this book quite a while ago. So yeah, I'm super excited about it. It's been really interesting going through the process of setting up an independent kind of press to do the self-publishing process and all of these things. I guess I should talk a little bit about what the book is. I'll just read a little bit from the back, perhaps, really quick. If you like fantasy, particularly if you like the young adult genre, I think you'll love it. I think if you're an adult, you'll hopefully love it too. I'm one of those people who believes that like children's fiction or young adult fiction is often more honest than the kind of like cynical or callous fiction that's written for adults. And I certainly don't believe in like talking down to children. So I'm hoping that it's something you find enjoyable even as an adult. But briefly reading the blurb here on the back. So why do we grow more scared as we get older? Hundreds of seasons ago, a wizard's war scarred the earth, leaving a malevolent fog blanketing the land and carrying the settlements within it like ships adrift at sea. The phantoms the fog creates are deadly to adults, so children must guard the walls now and care for each other. Ogma watches the fog from the walls of her windmill town. What felt like a game as a child becomes more of a creeping dread with each season she gets older. Ogma's town is attacked. Alien caravanners who roam the fog in inhuman forms have come to kidnap the children, and Ogma's lost in the fog. She must find hope, find courage in herself, and find her friends. So that's kind of the premise. I think if you enjoy Studio Ghibli stories like Spirited Away and things like that, if you like old-fashioned fairy tales like Oz or Arthur Rackham stuff, or even Makoto Shinkai films and things like that, I think it's a book that you will enjoy.
Awesome. Is this the first book you've written and published?
First one that I've published, yes. I've definitely written some other things that I decided were not ready for prime time. I've been involved writing for some game projects and things like that too. This is really my first like sense of making the whole thing real.
So I can think of a few people that have used Drupal to kind of like jumpstart a new career. Is the book writing can remain like a passion project that's along the side, or would you like to transition to be like a full-time author along the way?
Man, let me put it this way. You don't make a lot of money writing books. It's hard to pay the mortgage. So no, it's going to be a passion project. It's going to be something that to me, I treat with equal importance to my main career. And if I sold the film rights or something like that, yeah, I think I'd try and pursue that. But that's in the realm of what's realistic. I think it's something that I want to do together, side by side with what I'm doing in Drupal. They're both passion projects, really, both things that I kind of love doing. So, but yeah, it was really nice to make it happen.
I know we're just coming off book number 1, but like, are we thinking book number 2, or are we going to like take a break, or is this going to be like a series? What are you thinking?
It's definitely going to be a series. This is book 1. I think it reads as a complete story, so I don't think you're not going to be left on some huge cliffhanger. So don't need to worry about that. But I do have at least 2 more planned and partly outlined, and I have some plans to work on these things. The next big milestone, though, is going to be the audiobook release. So I have a very good friend who actually kind of my publishing partner who helped me get this across the finish line, and he's an audio engineer. And he read the book and said, hey, I really want to make this into an audiobook. And, actually came up to Portland, and we've been working on this for a while. And as a result, I decided I had to get the book across the finish line, but that means the audiobook is next on the list.
So are
That's
you
pretty
getting
cool.
like Liam Neeson to read it, or?
I'm going to narrate this one until I can
Oh.
afford a full cast production. Yeah.
Listen, I don't read so well, but if you need somebody to jump in there, I can do voices from time to time.
Excellent.
Tim, last but not least, where can people buy the book? Is it available now?
It's available now. You can buy it pretty much everywhere in terms of online retailers. You can buy it directly from me at aspenthornpress.com, or you can find it on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, on bookshop.org, which is an amazing online retailer where you can designate a local bookstore to get a share of every sale. So you can support your local store and still shop online. Kobo, Nook, like literally everything, including some international retailers. So I spent a lot of time learning this whole process. So you should be able to find it just to search for Fog and Fireflies. As for my author name on the jacket, it's printed T.H. Lehnen. So if you're looking me up that way, that's what to put in.
I just want to contrast this because most of the authors that we have on the show are more technical and usually Drupal related.
Of course.
and usually when we ask the question, are you going to be writing another book? They're like, no, never. Maybe in the future. Where maybe but I do it completely differently. Whereas it's nice to see the other side of it where you're ready to write more and
I'm just enthusiastic about storytelling, and to be honest,
Yeah.
it's not far. This probably sounds totally weird and like I'm reaching, but it's not far from what I do, even in open source, right? Like, there's a lot of creating narratives that help like unify the community in a particular direction, right? Or trying to tell a story of what the future of what Drupal could be, and to try and inspire contributors and things like that. To be honest, I think like the reason I'm a CTO is not because I was ever a great developer. It's because I kind of know how to communicate with people and empathize and do some of those sorts of things, which I think came from some of the passion for writing. So there's more crossover than you might expect. There's no DrupalCons anywhere in the book. But there are some on the website. And speaking of which, I've thought about writing a little case study. The aspenthornpress.com, which is my imprint that I'm using to publish this under, that is a Drupal 10 site published statically with Tome, Sam Mortenson's project. And so yeah, it uses a modified Olivero theme, which has a sort of dark mode. And it passes all the page speed insight stuff and accessibility checkers. So that might also be interesting for folks to check out if you're in that strange situation where you're like, you want to use Drupal, but you want to use it in a super low maintenance kind of thing because you don't want to make that a whole nother day job. So
I do the same thing, but here's the true test. Does it pass Drees's header test 10 out of 10?
Oh gosh,
that took so.
That yet.
It probably doesn't, to be fair.
Yeah.
It took way too much work for me to get my site to pass that. And YouTube isn't working on my site right now, so it's probably not a priority. But
I'd personally like to hear about this modified Olivero you're talking about, because I've been trying to retheme my site in Olivero similarly to what you got here for a while. So I would be interested in that aspect.
I haven't figured out, so I really need to clean it up. There's a lot of it's not as bad as I'm going to say, but this, the classic way of being like, okay, I'm just going to write a bunch of new CSS to override the original theme until I figure out how to do it right, kind of stuff. So I'd probably clean it all up before I contribute it back. But yeah, I did a few interesting things with it. Obviously, switched the color palette to a dark mode. I made it center at large screen sizes instead of left aligned, which was just a little thing that made my brain itch a little bit. I'm trying to think if there's anything else. Just a few little clever things with rotating testimonials at the top and some stuff like that. Some embedded media. Just there is a preview of the audiobook on the front page. Little things. But yeah, at some point maybe I'll share all that stuff.
Fabulous. And listeners, if you're listening and you want to buy the book, I'm a big fan of Amazon, but listen, go to aspenthornpress.com and you can see all your ordering options on there. But the first one is direct from the author, which I would implore you to do. Tim, as always, thank you for joining us. This has been a fabulous show, as always, with you. So appreciate your time.
Thanks again for having me. It's always great to be here. Always a wonderful conversation with y'all. So I appreciate it.
Do you have any questions or feedback? You can reach out to Talking Drupal on Twitter with the handle Talking Drupal or by email with show@talkingdrupal.com. You can connect with our hosts and other listeners on the Drupal Slack in the Talking Drupal channel.
You can promote your Drupal community event on Talking Drupal. Learn more at talkingdrupal.com/tdpromo.
And get the Talking Drupal newsletter to learn more about our guest hosts, show news, upcoming shows, and much more. Sign up for the newsletter at talkingdrupal.com/newsletter.
Thank you, patrons, for supporting Talking Drupal. Your support is greatly appreciated. You can learn more about becoming a patron at talkingdrupal.com and clicking that big Become a Patron button in the sidebar. All right, Tim, if folks wanted to get a hold of you about single sign-on, Drupal association stuff, your book, how would they best be able to do that?
There's a number of different ways. So I am Hestenet everywhere on the internet, pretty much, certainly on Drupal.org. You can reach me by email, tim@association.drupal.org. And you'll be able to find me at DrupalCon, which again, May 6th to 9th in Portland, Oregon. Love to see you there. There's actually some cool pricing options too. So if there happen to be any like local Portland listeners, there's a student ticket price that's only $50, which is like the cheapest ticket we've ever had. If you've done any kind of Drupal curriculum at all, it doesn't have to be like formal education curriculum. You can qualify for that rate. There's some nonprofit discounts. There's some government discounts and things like that. So we would love to see you there. When it comes to the book, my social handles for the book are all under sort of my pen name, which is just TH Lehnen. So feel free to look me up that way, send me a DM, and I'd be happy to chat with you about it.
Fabulous. Matt, what about you?
Best way to find me is to go to my website, mglommen.dev, and find links on my socials, and come see me at DrupalCon. I'll be hanging out at the Acquia booth.
Awesome. Nick, what about you?
You can find me at Nixvan, NICXVAN, pretty much everywhere.
And I'm John Picozzi. You can find me on all the major social networks and Drupal.org at John Picozzi. You can find me at DrupalCon, as others have said. And you can find out more about EPAM at epam.com.
And if you've enjoyed listening, we've enjoyed talking. See you guys next week.